Hello, my name is Eran Kaplan. I'm the Goldman Professor in Israel Studies at San Francisco State University. And it is my great pleasure to speak to you today about Avi Nesher, one of the most prolific directors in the history of Israeli cinema, and the subject, of course, of the documentary on the work and life of Avi Nesher. And I'd like to do two things today in my talk here about Avi Nesher. Is one, I will try to place him in the overall history of Israeli cinema, where this prolific director who directed more than a dozen features in Israel and a few movies in the United States, where he fits within the overall arc of Israeli cinema. And then I'd like to address the question that was raised in the documentary itself of why among his peers and among the professionals, the critics, he did not enjoy the type of success or recognition that some of his more successful commercial movies have achieved among the broader public. So that's also an issue that I would like to address. It's touched upon in the documentary, but I would like to offer a somewhat different perspective to explore this issue. So where does Avi Nesher fit? So when I think of the history of Israeli cinema, and the history of Israeli cinema actually starts before the creation of the state. It starts in the 1930s in the pre-state Yishuv, when the Zionist movement began to produce films in Palestine then. And those films were meant for fundraising purposes. This was really the beginning of what would be the Israeli film industry. And so it goes all the way back to the 1930s and then, of course, continues until this very day. So, in this almost now 100 years of history, there are three distinct periods. And I'll explain why I'm offering those divisions or those lines of demarcation. So, the first one is from the beginning, from the 1930s, and it goes all the way up to the early 1960s. And in this period, it was either the Zionist movement and then the State of Israel that funded directly the production of movies. So the movie came directly either from the Zionist organization or from the state. Very few films were produced. And the idea was that they should serve purpose of selling the Zionist idea, then the State of Israel to the world. These movies tended to be epic in scope. They tended to describe the landscape of Palestine, then Israel. It celebrated the achievements of the young community and the young state. They focused on war and struggle, but also building communities. And they were meant to portray Israel in a very positive, energetic light, both to influence other countries, but also to generate fundraising. And this was the purpose of the early movie industry in Israel. This all ended in the early 1960s when the State of Israel decided it was no longer worthwhile investing in those movies. Those movies were expensive and the impact was ultimately limited. So the state decided no longer to invest directly. Instead, it would offer tax incentives for private producers to produce movies in Israel. So this was a radical change in the industry. In fact, this model is very similar to the American model in many states, where tax incentives are offered to encourage and generate the production of films. And this is what happened in Israel in the early 1960s. And this led to two developments. On the one hand, the birth of kind of commercial Israeli cinema in the 1960s, where private producers invested money in order to make movies that will generate income, that they will make a profit from those movies. So this was one aspect. The other was the birth of kind of more avant-garde movie industry, whereby more of artistic inclined filmmakers would make movies with very limited budgets, with much of the crew and participants kind of volunteering their time. But they were able to create some incredible movies with hardly any investment. So these became the two kind of models of the production of films in Israel. And this was also the birth of not only commercial films, but also genre films in Israel. Now, what do I mean by genre films? Films that fall into very specific types of genres, like romantic comedies. So think of a romantic comedy. Almost all of them follow a certain formula, right? Run it in your head. 3 minutes into the movie, boy meets girl, girl meets boy. 10 minutes into the movie, we have a video montage of them on a boat, in a lake, or in a coffee shop falling in love. Then 33 minutes into the movie, a mysterious X appears. There's a shakeup in the plot, tensions, breakup, and then towards the end, there's resolution, and usually the film ends at a train station or an airport where the couple reunites. It's a formula that's been tried in hundreds of movies. That's a type of genre film. That's a romantic comedy. There are heist films, police dramas, all sorts of movies that fall into genres. This was the period when Israeli filmmakers made genre films, and they even developed a quintessentially Israeli type of genre film, the Burekas comedy. The first one was Salah Shabati in 1964. And then many Israeli movies over the next decade or so followed suit. And the formula here was a Mizrahi young man or woman meets an Ashkenazi young man or woman. They fall in love. Parents not happy with the romance, but the young couple overcomes the challenges and a happy ending at the end, and the melting pot of Israeli culture and society succeeds. This became a uniquely Israel genre of movies. It's also an indication that the Israeli public loved comedies. This is by far the most successful kind of movie making in the history of Israeli cinema. If you look at the 10 most successful movies in the history of Israeli cinema, almost all of them are comedies. And some of the numbers are astonishing. I mentioned Salah Shabati, 1964. Population of Israel, under 3 million. The movie sold over 1 million tickets in Israel. By this metric, it's the most successful movie in world history, where a third of the population of a country bought tickets to a movie. First, not a third, because many people watched it several times, but statistically, a third of the country, more than a third, went to see the movie. So comedies at that point were very, very successful. And by the 1970s, they moved away from the classic Burekas comedy, and they did all sorts of other comedies, some of them romantic, even sex comedies in the late 1970s that were also incredibly popular and successful. But then the era of commercial cinema in Israel came to an end by the late 1970s. And the main culprit was television. Television, as it did in other parts of the world, killed commercial cinema in Israel. But it came much, much later to Israel, because television only came to Israel in 1968. It's one of the last countries, developed countries, to introduce television in the world, partly because the labor governments that ruled Israel from the establishment of the state until the 1970s were vehemently opposed to television. Ben-Gurion and other laborite leaders viewed television as a decadent instrument that will destroy the pioneering spirit of Israeli youth. So they kept it out of the country. However, after the 1967 Six Days War, when Israelis became more affluent, that there was more cash, they started buying television sets. At this point, the government said, we can't have you watch Egyptian, Jordanian, or Syrian television. So they started broadcasting the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation in black and white. But still, television sets were very expensive in Israel because of import tariffs that were very, very high. However, in 1977, Labor lost the election and Likud came into power. And one of the first things that Likud did when it came to power is offer a major economic reform. inspired by Milton Friedman, who was one of the architects of that reform, and it included a massive decrease in the import tariffs in Israel, which made various what used to be luxury items now much, much cheaper, like electronics. So Israelis started buying television sets and color sets in increasing numbers. And at this point, basically all homes in Israel had televisions. And once you had a television at home, people stopped going to the movies. So attendance in movie theaters decreased dramatically. As a result, private producers no longer were incentivized to invest in movies, and this led to a crisis. And here the government stepped in and they would pass the Israeli cinema law, which over time would establish two public funds that would begin to basically fund the Israeli cinema, Israeli movie industry. And those funds were no longer tied to kind of a commercial rationale. Those funds receive the same amount of money every year, and they have to invest it in movies. Those funds don't care if the movies are commercially successful or not, because they just give away the money. They're not getting any money in return. So instead, they began to invest in what those funds that are led by professionals, people from the industry, academics, journalists. So these are professional funds that receive the funding from the government. So they had to establish kind of general criteria of what it is that they're looking for when they started funding Israeli movies. And what emerged is that they were looking for movies with a certain message, with certain ideas that would reflect Israel, that would become Israeli. Because what became the ultimate goal of those funds, as I said, not commercial success. They don't judge movies by ticket sales. For them, a successful Israeli movie is a movie that either makes it to the big festivals like Venice or Cannes or Berlin or Toronto, makes it into the festival, and especially the ones who big the major international awards like Golden Globes and the biggest of them all, the Academy Awards. And so they were looking for films, or they're looking for films that would have this appeal for those boards that then judge the movies from Israel. And what do those people, let's say we're on the selection committee of the Venice Film Festival, or we're a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures, and we want to judge the best foreign speaking movie of the year. So if we are judging an Israeli movie, are we interested in a romantic comedy or a sci-fi film? No, Hollywood probably makes better genre films. What we're looking for is an Israeli film. What is an Israeli film? A movie that deals with Israel. So starting in the 1980s, basically all Israeli movies deal with war, military service, the Holocaust, life on a kibbutz, the secular religious divide, big themes, big message that reveal to the world the type of issues that Israelis are consumed with. That's what dominates public discourse in Israel. But this is what the movies became. And the movies became no longer genre films, but kind of realistic dramas that tell the story of Israel. So this is the evolution that began in the 1980s. Now, where do we place Avi Nesher, our protagonist here? Avi Nesher came into Israeli cinema towards the end of the commercial period, and he distinguished himself as one of the most successful directors of comedies, as the documentary tells us. He directed two of the most successful commercial films in Israeli history, The Troop and Dizengoff 99, and this was towards the latter phase of kind of the commercial period. And then he would reinvent himself as an Israeli serious director in the 2000s directing what we now perceive as Israeli movies, films that deal with war, the memory and trauma of the Holocaust, the place of religious community within Israeli society, and all those heavy themes that we now tend to associate with Israeli cinema. So let's talk about the early period of Avi Nesher, when he joined the kind of commercial uh, period. And here he followed in the footsteps of two older directors. And I think that those three, Menachem Golan, who is a generation older than Avi Nesher, the most prolific director and producer in the history of Israeli cinema, and then Boaz Davidson, who produced the most successful film in Israeli history. And Avi Nesher, in many ways, continued in their tradition. So, of course, Menachem Golan, born in the late 1920s, he's one of the founders of the Israeli film industry. And in 1962, he directed and produced one of the first action films in Israel history, the El Dorado, with Topol in one of the first roles by Topol 2 years before he would become Salah Shabati. And Menachem Golan would then produce and direct some of the most successful Burekas comedies in the history of Israeli cinema, including Kazablan, again, one of the top 5 blockbusters in the history of Israeli cinema. And then Menachem Golan moved to the United States and became a very successful producer. He had a production company, Canon Films, with where he produced some very successful, not the best of American cinema, but some of the more successful Chuck Norris films and other action films of the 1980s. Quentin Tarantino, by the way, huge fan of the Canon films of Menachem Golan of the 1980s. So if he likes them, then I can gives us some kind of a approval, general approval, if it's coming from Quentin Tarantino. So Menachem Golan, in many ways, set the formula. In his footsteps came Boaz Davidson. Boaz Davidson studied film in London in the 1960s. So he had kind of professional training in the West, and he brought his training back to Israel. He started with the more avant-garde kind of independent cinema and worked there. But then he moved to commercial comedies. And in 1978, he produced the most successful film in the history of Israeli cinema, Eskimo Limon, or Lemon Popsicles. It was a kind of a sex comedy, think Porky's or American Pie. Incredibly successful, both in Israel, but also in Thailand and Germany, where it was a blockbuster. This movie and the movie spawned sequels, a rarity in Israeli cinema, and it included nudity and sex scenes. I gave another lecture for this festival where I spoke about the fact that Israeli cinema has very little romance and desire, which is true, but for every general statement, there are also exceptions. And the comedies of the late 1970s are the great exception. The other interesting thing that Davidson did with Lemon Popsicle, and that we will see also informed Avi Nesher, is that he placed his movies in the past. He placed his movie Lemon Popsicles in 1959, and he used the soundtrack of American pop music from the late 1950s. So there was kind of a retro nostalgic element to the movie, very reminiscent of American Graffiti, which clearly influenced that movie. Avi Nesher would follow immediately in those footsteps, and what, as we see it in the documentary, like Boaz Davidson, he spent a many of his formative years in the United States. He went to high school in the United States. He then went to college in the United States. So he brought with him a certain American sensitivity back to Israel. And as a very young man, as the documentary shows us, he created this movie. And the first movie in 1978 was The Troop, Halehaka, and it's about an army entertainment troupe. Now, I told you that he was making genre films, commercial films, not the serious, heavy topic Israeli films. So this movie takes place in a military unit. It takes place during a time of war. But it says absolutely nothing about the war, nothing about politics, and nothing about the military. It's a group of young people who are obsessed with their careers, success, making out, fighting with one another. It's as if an American movie takes place in a high school or college. It's in Israel, so it's in an army entertainment troupe. But it really says nothing about Israel or the Israeli condition. And it's also a celebration of youth culture or counterculture. And in this regard, Israel came to the scene about a decade later than the United States or Britain. So if we think of 1967 here in California as the summer of love and sexual liberation and breaking boundaries and the new drug culture, in Israel, it would happen about 10 years later. So in this regard, both Nesher and Davidson captured a certain change in Israeli society. Another interesting choice is that he celebrates the music of the army entertainment troops that were hugely popular in Israel in the 1950s, 60s, and up until the early 1970s. And those army entertainment troops were so popular that if you wanted a career in entertainment in Israel, you basically had to go through those army entertainment troops. If you look at all the popular singers in Israel in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, if you look at all the popular actors and comedians, they all came through the ranks of those army entertainment troops. From Topol to Uri Zohar to Ike Einstein, all the biggest stars came through those ranks. And so the songs of those army entertainment troops, they were the soundtrack of Israel in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s. Now, the movie was filmed in 1978, but it takes place in 1970. And what is interesting is that it's already nostalgic because by the late 1970s, the army entertainment troops were no longer relevant. They stopped being a thing. They still existed, but they had no relevance in the popular culture. They were already a relic. So just like in American Graffiti, where a movie produced in the 70s, you look back to the 1950s and celebrate the oldies. Here, in a way, Avi Nesher is celebrating what Israel used to be, but no longer is. And if you happen to watch The Troop, which I highly recommend, you'll notice that the young soldiers, the young entertainers, they sing the Hebrew songs written for the Army Entertainment Troupe. But when they're off stage, on the bus or in their tents, they're playing Beatles songs or Rolling Stones songs because the view is now already to the west and moving forward. And The Troop was a major commercial success at the box office and became really a staple of Israeli popular culture. Every year, the various television stations show the movie. It's on kind of a constant loop. It's part of the soundtrack of most Israelis, kind of the collective memory. Then he followed this up with another commercial hit, Dizengoff 99. Again, the documentary describes the production and what the movie is about, which is about the life of young people in the 20s in Tel Aviv trying to make it as writers, as filmmakers, producing commercials. And again, it's a celebration of youth and the new culture with some of the most explicit sex scenes in the history of Israeli cinema that drew a lot of controversy and attention and didn't hurt at the box office, as was the case. So, very interesting in this regard. Then he made, as the documentary shows, a couple of other films that were not successful. And then he made a very interesting movie in the early 1980s, Rage and Glory, that deals with some members of the Lehi, that was the radical right wing Jewish underground before the creation of the state. but this was still an attempt at creating a genre film. So even though it deals with a historical movement, with historical events, the movie says nothing about them. It's a movie about basically professional fighters or killers who happen to be members of the Lehi. But there's absolutely no message, no judgment, no politics. It's kind of a stylistic action movie, one of a rarity in the history of Israeli cinema, but a movie that was not really all that successful in the box office. And following that, as the documentary details, uh, Avi Nesher left Israel, moved to the United States, and he would make several genre films in the United States and kind of make a career as a writer, producer within the film industry. And he would only be in the early part of this century that he would return to Israel and kind of rejoin the Israeli film industry. And he came back with a bang, now to a completely different landscape. This is now the landscape of the movie funds, the Rabinovich Fund, the Israeli Film Fund, that provide a substantial amount of the budget of the Israeli movies, which of course could be supplemented by private producers as well, but they provide a substantial part of the budget of those films. And in many ways, Avi Nesher reinvented himself now as an Israeli director working within this new climate. And the movies that he would continue making, and he's still making movies, he's very active. His most recent movie came out a year ago, are very typical of what became Israeli cinema. So his first big movie was Turn Left at the End of the World. And it's really a celebration of two immigrant communities who live in southern Israel, in Dimona, in the development town, immigrants from Morocco and India who unite around a cricket game that the immigrants from India brought with them to Israel. And here we have more of what we now think of Israeli cinema since the 1980s, looking at issues that dominate Israel: immigration, absorption of immigrants, tensions among different groups, and how the groups negotiate their identity and the place within Israeli society. And this movie struck a chord because it was also a relative commercial hit, nothing like the movies of the 1970s at the box office, but still a very successful movie. He will not reach those heights. None of his subsequent movies would be quite as successful at the box office, but they are quite successful for Israeli cinema. And again, he would now begin to explore all those big themes that we would expect coming out of Israeli cinema. He made several films that explore the trauma of the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust and the legacy of the Holocaust in Israeli society. He did several films that look at the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. This has become very popular among Israeli filmmakers over the past 20 years. He also did a historical movie about the 1948 war and one of the legendary battles on the Egyptian front. So these are much more typical uh, products of what we now associate with Israeli cinema. So he really, in a way, reinvented himself as an Israeli filmmaker. He was once more of a genre, kind of Americanized professional filmmaker, and now much more typical of the overall industry. However, he has yet to receive the type of recognition that from his peers and from the critics that I think that he expects, and that someone who had so much success at the box office might also want to see. And the main issue is that none of his movies won the Ophir Prize. The Ophir Prize is the Israeli Oscars. That's the prize that the Israeli Academy of Pictures uh, gives every year. And what is important about the Ophir Prize is that the winner then represents Israel at the Academy Award. This becomes the Israeli nominee that's sent to the Academy for consideration. And as we know, several Israeli films made it all the way to the top five in this century. None have won, but they made it to the ceremony in Hollywood, which is quite the achievement. But Avi Nesher has not made it. And this really is an interesting question. The documentary leans heavy into the issue of jealousy and suggests jealousy as the answer. Perhaps, maybe. Yes, he is commercially still much more successful than the majority of Israeli filmmakers who commercially perform very poorly at the box office. But I'm not sure that it is the only explanation. So here I want to go back and explore the question of what it is that the Israeli film industry, both the funds and people in the greater orbit of the film industry, what they're looking for in a movie, what they think of as an Israeli film. And here, what stands out, if you look at the history of Israeli cinema from the 1980s onwards, the majority of Israeli films is the fact that many of them do not offer resolution. There isn't the classic Hollywood ending. So many of the Israeli films are actually open-ended. They either end abruptly or they end with a death of a main character that offers no cathartic kind of release at the end or understanding. This is ultimately an attempt to remain true to a certain form of realism. Because in life, there is no resolution. There is no cathartic end at the end of the day. You just go on and continue. And in many ways, the majority of Israeli films, and I ask you, those who are attending this festival, you probably have seen your share of Israeli films. Just think of how many of them end in this kind of open-ended, frustrating, unresolved manner. This is really a staple of Israeli cinema. With Avi Nesher, no. His movies, even the Israeli films or the realistic drama, do offer resolution. In this regard, he is still true to his American origins. And there's this American element to his films. One of the critics in the documentary describes it as the sweetness of his movie making. And I think that what it means is that you come out with a sense of satisfaction from the movie because it ended and you understand how it ended and the movie and the plot came to a close and the characters had a kind of full arc of development. It ends meaningfully. But this is not what the majority of Israeli movies do. They're actually open-ended. And so I think that the Israeli Academy of Movies, when they judge films, they're looking for what they believe is a quintessential Israeli film. And in this regard, Avi Nesher is an outsider. He doesn't fit what has now become the mold of Israeli cinema. He is considered, in this regard, too American or too sentimental. And I think this is ultimately the reason why his movies did not receive the kind of recognition that he believes, and maybe other believes, that he should have received as a filmmaker. So there's a kind of a frustration that you probably have sensed in the documentary about Avi Nesher. At this point, I'd like to share with you the closing moments of the troupe, Haleaka, the celebration of the Army Entertainment Troupe. And the movie ends with a great crescendo. It's Avi Nesher, there's a resolution, it all comes together. And the troupe, after some tensions and issues, and they almost fall apart, and at some point, the commanders even threaten to disband this Army Entertainment Troupe because of all the trouble and tensions and egos. They're able to overcome their challenges and they have a major concert that's going to be filmed on Israeli television. So I want to show you the end of this film where they sing Shir Shalom, the Song of Peace, which was one of the biggest hits ever performed by an army entertainment troupe. by Lakat Nahal back in 1970. And let's see a few moments from this scene.
תחזירו לכאן.
איש אותנו לא ישיב,
מפה תחתית אפל,
כאן לא יועילו,
לא שמחת הניצחון,
ולא שירי הלל. לכן רק שירו, שיר השלום, אל תלחש תפילה. מוטב תשירו, שיר השלום, בצעק הגדולה.
מול השמש לחדול, מבעד לפרקים,
אל תביטו לאחור, הניחו להולכים. שאו עיניים ותקווה, לא דרך כוונות.
שירו שיר לאהבה ולא למלחמות. אל תגידו יום יבוא, הביאו את היום,
כי לא חלמו
בכל הכיכרות הריעו רק שלום. לכן רק שירו, שיר השלום, אל תלחשו תפילה. מוטב תשירו, שיר השלום, בצעקה גדולה. תנו לשמש לעלות, לבוקר להאיר. חזקה של התפילות, אותנו לא תחזיר. מי אשר נבננו, ובאדמת נטמן. בקימה לא יעירו, לא יחזירו לכאן. לכן רק שירו, שיר השלום, אל תלחשו תפילה. מוטב תשירו, שיר השלום, בצעקה גדולה. שירו, שיר השלום, אל תלחשו תפילה. מוטב תשירו, שיר השלום, בצעקה גדולה. שירו, שיר השלום, אל תלחשו תפילה. מוטב תשירו, שיר השלום, בצעקה גדולה. שיר השלום, אל תלחשו תפילה. שיר השלום, בצעקה גדולה.
So this scene was filmed at the Shavit movie theater in Givatayim, a suburb of Tel Aviv, in 1978. It's one of those older cinemas that was about 1,500 seats. And as you saw, they brought a lot of people to fill the hall. So they went to two schools, a high school and an elementary school. I happened to be a student in one of those elementary schools. And I was one of the kids sitting in the stands while this scene was filmed. We spent about 3 or 4 hours that day shooting this film. Whenever I watch this clip or this movie, I try to see if I can find myself in the crowd. I've yet to do so. But it was an incredible day, and I'd like to think that my love of cinema and Israeli cinema especially was formed that afternoon when they filmed it. But so I have my own kind of personal connection to the cinema of Avi Nesher. So this makes it all the more exciting for me to talk about him. So Thank you very much. And I hope it'll be an opportunity for you to go and watch many of the films of Avinesha that are available on various streaming services. Enjoy. Thank you.